Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about the journey forward for businesses post-pandemic. It's been a turbulent 2 years, to say the least, a tough 2 years. So what should businesses and their CIOs focus on now? What's most important? To discuss that, I'm joined by four major thought leaders. With me is Rita Gunther McGrath, professor at Columbia Business School, and she's been rated one of the 25 smartest women to follow on Twitter by Fast Company magazine. Hello to you, Rita.
Hi there. Pleasure to be here.
And right after this event, I'm gonna go follow you on Twitter. No doubt about that.
Great. You'd be welcome.
We may be joined by Paul Weinwand in a second. Let's see. In the meantime, also with me is Kim Stevenson, former CIO of Intel, now works as an independent advisor on boards. Kim, very good to have you with us today.
Thanks, James. Glad to be here.
And rounding out our panel is Miles Sewer, who, according to LeadTail, is the #1 leading influencer of CIOs today. And he's a director of solution marketing at Elation, which is a hot Silicon Valley data company. That's pretty cool. Miles, you've got a lot going on.
I do. But I try and keep it all going. And we've got CIO Chat Live coming on in a couple of weeks.
And here we have Mr. Weinwand, who may join us, which would be fantastic. We'll give him just a moment to say hello. Let's talk about where we were and where we're going. What were the biggest changes to how businesses operated during the pandemic crisis? I mean, we're not totally out of it, but we hope we see a brighter future ahead. Most important, what did we learn from the crisis? Rita, what is your take?
Well, it's a cliche by now to say that it accelerated a lot of things that were already underway. One thing I've heard a lot is people are saying things like, wow, we really surprised ourselves with how great we were in the crisis. We took immediate action, we made decisions, we dropped all politics, we cooperated with competitors if it was necessary. And, why can't we be like that all the time? It's what I hear a lot.
Interesting. Kim, what is your take? I mean, what was the big challenge in your view, and what did we learn from it?
Yeah, so I would say the probably the easiest thing that happened was the entire company was aligned. In fact, your customers were aligned with what had to happen. So it had to happen quick, but you had to enable employees to be productive. You had to be able to continue to serve customers. So the priorities were so crystal clear that that's what allowed sort of the politics and budget obstacles and those kinds of things to just go away. And so to the extent, when I think about the role of the CIO today in sort of the post-pandemic world, you want to preserve that clarity of priorities and that alignment across the company. And the CIO then is in a position to, drive that alignment, because everybody else in the company is in a functional role, and they're either trying to run finance or trying to run manufacturing or trying to run sales. And the CIO has to cut across all of those. And so I think it becomes part and parcel of their responsibility to keep that alignment so that the company can execute as well in any environment.
Miles, what do you see? What was the big problem, and what did we learn from it?
Well, I mean, first of all, beyond the doctors and nurses and all the people who supported them, CIOs turned out to be the big heroes in all this, because nobody had ever thought that you could put this many people remote and have them be able to work. I mean, nothing that they put in place was designed to necessarily scale. Now, fortunately, many had made investments in cloud and other types of technology, and they were able to surge. We did have problems. I remember doing some events where Zoom didn't quite scale appropriately, but now it does. And so I think they became heroes of their organization, and people came to them in a new light than they ever did before. And now, transformation is accelerating, if anything. And there's two types of transformation that seem to be accelerating my vantage point. One is transformation in terms of how you run your business and what your value is and all of those things. But the other side is, how do people work? Because it's been clear that people have been Zoom fatigued and always connected. And so we're starting to discover what the boundary conditions are and how do we effectively allow people to work effectively in a digital virtual environment.
Right, which is a big shift, to be sure. I mean, I think one of the amazing things we saw is the importance of staff and of human connection. It turns out that people need people. Who knew? I mean, I think we knew that, prior to 2019, but I think it really became clear in the crisis. And Miles, you mentioned that CIOs were the big heroes during the pandemic crisis. What should they continue to do now to have a seat at the table and to have business relevance? Kim, what advice would you give CIOs now?
Yeah, I would say it starts with really understanding the business, not IT, right? But the business. What is the company strategy? How are you going to execute that? And what role will technology play in the execution of the strategy? And if everything is framed from that lens, I think that allows that alignment that I spoke of earlier to happen. And I think, again, it falls upon the CIO to be able to translate that strategy, the company business strategy, into IT plans that their teams can then go execute, right? I think too often the IT organization doesn't have a bigger context and perspective across what the company is trying to get done. And I think that's one of the chief roles of the CIO now, is to make sure they can translate that strategy into executable plans for the organization.
Paul, I see you have joined us. I'm glad you're with us. Please introduce yourself, and I've got a question for you.
Excellent. So great to be with everybody. I'm Paul Langwand. I'm a principal with PwC. I also am an adjunct professor of strategy at Northwestern's Kellogg School. I've been really fortunate to do a lot of research on the topic of strategy, management, leadership with Harvard, with a number of books published and articles. So really happy to join this great team.
So we're talking about the fact that CIOs were a big hero during the crisis. They really had to step up. What advice would you give them now to have continued relevance?
No question. I mean, for sure, I think our leadership teams in general have a lot on their agenda at the moment. And actually, if you think about what's ahead, there's going to be the next crisis, there's going to be the next set of decisions. I think CIOs play this incredible role of not only being at the front of all the technology decisions, but they're able to see when the organization in general has got the strategy figured out and knows what technology is required or may not. And I think being able to bring that discussion to the leadership team, raise the bar in terms of what does that leadership team really need to drive in terms of decision making, all of the investments that are going to be made, and holding that team accountable to actually make progress on those topics.
Miles, your take? What advice would you give to a CIO right now?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know how many have taken strategy classes in their curriculum, but they're in the middle of strategy now. And in many respects, when you look at where you need to be able to sense things that are happening faster, I mean, it's in technology. And so they need to become, I think, the CEO's not only best friend, but closest confidant, because they're going to be, I love the little remark that you have in Rita in your book about the snow melting at the edges. They're the best place to go see if the snow is melting at the edges, kind of a thing, I think.
Rita, what is your view? What advice would you give to CIO right now?
I would say you want to be, picking up on what Miles said, you want to be ahead of the game. And by that, I mean, like if you had said to somebody years and years and years ago, like, what's your electricity strategy? That would have been a real conversation that people were having back in the day, right? Because if you think about it, factories were all set up to draw on a single power source, whether that was a river or a steam engine or whatever. And the design of the factory was all based on that central shaft that drove everything. And once you had electricity, you could completely redesign the factory. Each machine could have its own source of power, but it took something like 60 years before the potential of that innovation was realized. So fast forward to our times, and there was a while there where people were saying, what's your digital strategy? And it's almost like asking, what's your electricity strategy? So I would say what CIOs want to be thinking about is, if I was that factory manager, right, what would I be doing today to take advantage of these new capabilities that are being built so that I'm one of the the early movers on moving from, steam engines to electricity, and the equivalent would be digital today.
Just to clarify your analogy, when you say electricity and digital are essentially the same, you mean that it's so taken for granted?
Well, today we take electricity for granted, absolutely.
Sure.
And I think the analogy to digital is there was a period there where we were talking about digital as though it was a thing, right? Let's
Right.
go back to the 90s, right? What's your web strategy, right? And today what we realize is just as electricity was back in the day, or it is for us today, it's in everything, right? It's these layers of information and connectivity that are just pervasive. And so to speak about it as a thing separate from the business doesn't make any sense anymore.
All right, let's look at the priorities of businesses. What should the priorities of businesses be that want to create business differentiation in an increasingly digital world? Paul, what is your view?
Oh,
Sorry, I love the analogy that Rita brings.
Wasn't that
around-
neat? Yeah, that really resonated that with me.
Well, and it's a good segue to your question, because I think in many ways, one of the challenges for CIOs is that, if we all digitize the same things, we're not going to create that differentiation. And in many ways, that's what we're seeing with so many organizations, right? Which is, I've got to digitize, I've got to catch up. I see this company doing X and that company doing Y. I'm worried about disruption coming. Let me catch up. And if 98% of your budget is catching up, right, you're going to be at risk of people jumping in front and not being advantaged. And in today's environment, being okay is not enough, right? We have too many choices as customers and consumers. And so I think the CIO really has to separate, yes, digitization, but towards what end, towards what benefits, towards what outcomes do our customers need? Because there's so many technology choices. Some of them are going to need to be table stakes. I have to have them. And some of them can really be supporting differentiation. And we have to be clear between those two types.
Miles, your view, how can businesses create business differentiation these days?
well, I mean, I think it comes back to what are the core business capabilities, and then how does digital play along with those? So I have two quick case studies. One is Nordstrom's, who was always about personal experience. And so they figured out how to connect their supply chain data to what you bought, and then to put a predictive algorithm. And it actually was better at picking out outfits regardless of where you were. The other one that I love that Paul talks about in his book is Zara. Zara decides to do RFID tags because it'll be better for the supply chain. And then they realize it gives them immediate information on what sells and what doesn't. And so they change what they make based upon real data. So I think we're in a world where you need to know, this is why the CIO can't just flip from industry to industry. They have to know their industry, how it functions, the business model, and then how does digital allow to change those business models.
Rita, your view on creating business differentiation these days?
Well, it has to start with the customer. And I have a perspective on that borrows from Tony eWEEK and Clay Christensen, which is to say, customers have jobs they want to get done in their lives, and they hire and fire your organizations to get those jobs done. Or if they're not happy with the way you're doing it, they'll fire you. And I think too many executives focus on the tech, or they focus on their product, or they're very product out, and they're not really looking at what's the customer trying to get done. So just as a data point, right, I went and looked at shopping cart abandonment for internet shopping carts for a whole variety of different sectors, and at a high it's something like 86%, and the lowest was something like 67%, and most of the rest were in the sort of 70% range. So think about that, right? You've gotten the customer to your website, you've created enough visual and other collateral they're interested in buying, your price is okay, they've said that's fine, they put the thing in the cart, and then you lose them. And
right.
So I think the teaching point there is you can't just look at what you do in isolation. You have to look at it in the context of what I call a customer consumption chain, where customers are moving through a series of events. And if that chain breaks, you've lost the sale. So I think you need to look at it very holistically, customer back and not company out, which is all too often what we do.
Interesting. Kim, your view on your business differentiation?
Yeah, so I would 100% agree with Rita that it starts with the customer and knowing what the customer is trying to solve, right? And everything you do should be, you should start the meeting with, this is the customer issue we're trying to solve. This is the customer problem we're trying to create. This is the value we're doing. But then it isn't good enough to just solve the customer problem. You have to be able to explain why your solution is better than anybody else's out there. And so I always put that as the how and the why, how you solve the problem and why you're better than anyone else. And if you can sort of get in that mode at every project you're looking at in IT, at every customer, like asking your internal customers, why are they doing it? How in their world, how would the customer's problem be solved? And then you can really help them. But you always have to have that frame around it in terms of, you know, how you're going to solve their problem and why will it be better than competition.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about technology investments. Where can focused technology investments help organizations bridge forward, and what role should experimentation play in how they're implemented? Miles, experimentation?
I think, I just talked to CIOs about this yesterday, and I think one of the things that they're telling me is, well, we don't necessarily know what the right direction is all the time, but let's go seed a couple of things and see how it comes out. I mean, the other thing one CIO said to me recently that I thought it was better is an experiment that validates an assumption that you can show to others is actually better than 50 PowerPoint slides trying to sell them on something, because they get the concept. I mean, somebody was telling me a while back that when they were defining the internet, they couldn't come up with language that anybody would understand, but everybody knows how to do it today. So if you can make the experience clear, I think that's really important. And then be able to, as Jeffrey Moore says, put it in the transition zone and get it out and as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm. Rita, I want to ask you about technology investment and the idea of experimentation. I think it's really interesting because most companies spend so much money in their technology, they don't want to use the word experimentation. Your view?
Oh, I think experimentation is crucial. So if you imagine a continuum where on the one side you've got absolute certainty, you know, things are very predictable and it just turns over and over, versus the situation we're all in, whether we want to or not, of having high uncertainty. I mean, I can't tell you where the virus is going to be in 6 months, nor can you, nor can anybody else on the planet. So when you're in that high uncertainty situation, the value you're creating is more and more connected to option value. And by option value, what I mean is a small investment you're making today that buys you the right to make a bigger investment or a more substantial thing down the road when you know more. And so options should be small, they should be uncertain, they should be experimental, and they should be able to teach you something, even if they don't work out in and of themselves, right? So even an option that doesn't work out shows you why a particular direction may not be fruitful or not. So I really think senior leaders are going to have to get a lot more comfortable with the idea that we're doing this because it's something that we need to spend a little bit of resource on to figure out what the next step is going to be. Second thing I think that's going to be super important is taking these big monolithic plans and breaking them down into what I call checkpoints, which are essentially learning events. So, do that customer prototype, do the demo, do the mock-up of a website where you see if anybody will click on it, before you go and make this huge technology investment.
Interesting. Kim, your view on technology investment?
Yeah. So first I would say the spectrum for what the CIO should be looking at in terms of technology investment has expanded from the traditional IT enterprise systems to really every product and service the company makes. And so you want to take your experimentation where it's going to give you the most value. So any enterprise process, HR process, finance process, accounts payable, whatever, let the Workdays, the SAPs, the Salesforces of the world experiment with that stuff. You should be experimenting with the things that make your company money. And you have to be very clear about that. When I was with Intel, we made money in two ways, right? We manufactured things and we designed product. So every bit of investment, incremental investment, went to improve those two things. It didn't go to improve other things. We would just purchase that service from someone else. And so when you get really clear on that, then it's easy to have the discussion of, X% of my budget is going to go every year to innovation. And it's a small number, right? But if it's a consistent number, and then you're churning products through that, we always would say we would build, operate, transfer, right? We would build it, test it with the customers, internal customers, and then if it was good enough, if it solved the real problem, then we would, build it into an operating process and transfer it into production. So, I don't really buy the excuse that no one has budget for innovation or for experimentation, because I think you have to make the budget for it by delivering value each and every year through that experimentation. So you have to be able to graduate the projects and learn. And I think it was Rita that said, learning from the failure is just as important, and being able to share that learning so that you don't repeat that same type of failure going forward.
Paul, what advice would you give about technology investment and experimentation?
I love what's been discussed. I mean, I think, one thing I'd add is that a lot of our research over the years has always pointed towards this idea of coherence, right? That organizations are inherently a little bit incoherent, right? They like to pursue lots of different things. They like to chase growth. They like to make investments. They like to kind of figure out what industry best practices are and catch up. And yet the ones that do really well are coherent around what they're promising to their customers, the capabilities that are needed, and the products and services that fit that. And that lots of experimentation in the wrong places tends to drive incoherence. That being said, experimentation is critical as long as we know what it's driving towards. So I really liked how Rita described this, that yes, get some of that out there. You can afford some level of incoherence. Everybody's incoherent to a certain point, but make sure that incoherence is working for you and not being done randomly. Give your team some direction about where to experiment, right? So that you can drive to your future. The second thing I'd say is that in our research in this latest book, Beyond Digital, Matt Money and I found that probably the single biggest investment that was being made productively was something called privileged insights. And that's kind of like the old market research is I conduct surveys and I get lots of information. That's not that helpful anymore because everybody can get the same information. One of the best investments we saw these organizations like Adobe and Citigroup and Komatsu and others in actually building the data and tools to understand what your customers are doing all the time, because they're willing to share a lot with you if you create the right experience and trust. But that does take technology. It takes lots of investment. It takes thinking about what that experience should be. So if there's one investment I'd really encourage, think about that connection with your customers. How are you actually improving their lives and their business? And what information are you getting so that you can actually create the next set of products and services?
Interesting.
So
we have just
just
we're going to ask something, Miles, please. Yeah.
I just wanted to amplify something Kim said.
Sure.
The CIO used to be focused on taking cost out of business processes. That's the focus. But what I'm hearing from the CIOs I'm talking to is the shift has really gone to that last item she talked about, which was the business model, how it gets substantiated. How do I grow the business? That's where the investment is going. Yes, you have to have back office systems continue, and we have to make them elegant because we're all remote. But the focus really has shifted in terms of where CIOs are at.
We have just a few minutes left. I'd love to get a sense from the four of you. What is one last thing that the companies really need to know about digital transformation? First of all, should we retire the term digital transformation? Should we stop using it? But if we're still using it, what's something that companies should know? We definitely give them advice. Rita, your closing thought?
Sure. Start small, demonstrate proof of concept, add value.
That's like no wasted words. Just there you go. Could you give me that one more time?
Start small, demonstrate proof of concept, and add value. And if you'd like an example, I could go into one of those.
Please do. Yes.
So one of my the companies I work with is a company called Klockner, which is a metal services provider in Germany. And their CEO had a bit of a revelation. He said, we could get Amazon, we could get knocked out of our markets by somebody who creates a trading platform for our business. And so he tried to start the company down a path of digital transformation, working at home in Duisburg, which is kind of the Rust Belt of Germany. And that didn't go anywhere. So finally, he took 2 engineers, sent them off to Berlin, which is the Silicon Valley of Germany. And he said, look, I want you to do something, anything that adds value to a customer in the sense of making us easier to do business with. So at the time, customers were still faxing in orders, whenever the offices were closed or whatever, literally faxing in orders. And so the first thing this team tackled was let's digitize the fax, which is a small thing, right? But if you think about it from the organization's point of view, in the old days, the fax would hit the boundary of the organization and then stuff would happen on the other side. Okay, electronic order hits the boundary of the organization, 0 change on the other side. You're not disrupting anybody, but you are making it better for the customer. And that's what I mean by start small and add value. You don't want to go in there guns ablaze and all of a sudden everybody's freaked out because their jobs are changing, right? You want to go in there with a demonstration of value to all the necessary parties that have to make this successful.
Mm-hmm. Kim, are you still using the term digital transformation? And if you are, what do companies need to know about it?
So I would say yes, that the term is still being used. I do think we're on the cusp, as you suggested, that we should move beyond that because it needs to be the fabric of every business. I think my piece of advice for CIOs today is to live the life of your customer. Don't paper walk it, but go be a customer from end to end, from the full life cycle, and then document where there is friction and then work on those friction points, because that will help make your products and services better. It will help build loyalty with customers, and you'll solve the things from a different lens, from the lens of the customer. And I think that's so important. And the more of your team you can take on a field trip with you that way, the more you're going to be building the next generation of leaders in IT.
Paul, you get a chance to use the word digital transformation in a sentence. What do companies need to know?
I like Kim's sort of move beyond that, especially because the book we wrote is called Beyond Digital. And the reason why we think that digital transformation is really not that effective anymore is because it doesn't define on its own what I'm transforming towards. This idea that most organizations are not differentiated, I think people recognize that. There are some that are. And we really encourage leaders to step back and figure out what is their place in the world? What would happen if they disappeared? What unique solution are they providing to a meaningful customer societal challenge? We've got to answer that question. And then we can transform towards that destination. And digital will be an ingredient, but there's going to be lots of other ingredients. And I think we're putting too much emphasis on digital somehow transforming ourselves when we actually need quite a bit more to get the job done.
Miles, your take on digital transformation?
It's interesting. MIT and EY claimed that they came up with the term. So I don't know if that's true, but they do.
What year would that have been, I wonder?
About 2014, 13, somewhere in there.
Okay.
But what's interesting is it had a little bit of business model in it, but didn't really talk about it significantly. I think now we're talking about how do we transform the products that we deliver, the experience that people have with it, and so this is a great place for the CIO to really think about things. I know in my conversations with CIOs recently that they aren't going to do a project to just take cost off the equation anymore. That it has to have a business outcome to it. So my take is that we are kind of in a digital world that's beyond, because every industry has a disruptor who can come in who's better at data and other things than they are. So I think it's time now for CIOs and strategists and business leaders to figure out how do they use this to transform their business capabilities and win.
Good stuff. Miles, Rita, Kim, Paul, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to be here.
Great being here.